Stop ignoring post-flop ICM. Hey guys, TomBoss21 here, and today we're going to take a deep dive into one of the least studied yet most important aspects of tournament poker. Here's the outline for this video. We're going to start with some ICM fundamentals so everyone can get caught up. We're going to look at when this actually matters most by examining risk premium by tournament phase for various types of MTTs. And then we're going to dive into the post-flop adjustments. Specifically, we'll be covering, first of all, how the covering player can be more aggressive. Second of all, the effect of downward drift. And lastly, the surprising mathematics behind ICM and why you should bluff and fold more in MTTs. Let's start with the fundamentals. So first of all, ICM versus chip EV. Now these are two terms in poker. Chip EV means you're trying to maximize the expected value of chips. In other words, you're trying to accumulate as many chips as possible. Whereas ICM, or the independent chip model, means you're trying to win as much money as possible. And even though these two things might seem like the same thing, they're not. There are certain spots in tournaments in which you should actually pass on extra chips in order to have better odds of surviving. In a previous video, we've outlined how playing chip EV in tournaments punts money left, right, and center. So for example, in single race pots, on average, chip EV punts about 10% of a buy-in every single time you see a flop on the bubble and the final table. In a 3-bet pot, that can be upwards of 30%. So it is crucial that you learn to play post-flop ICM because playing chip EV, even if you're playing it perfectly, loses a ton of money. And let's face it, no one's playing perfectly. Okay, back up a second. How does ICM work? Well, at its core, ICM takes every player's stack as an input. So what is the size of every stack in the entire tournament? It outputs the finishing probabilities of each of those stacks, and then you just multiply the prize structure times the probability of finishing first, second, third, and so on to calculate a player's EV. Now, of course, you can't exactly do this at the table. It's too complex, but you can learn some really useful heuristics and takeaways that you can use to adjust your post-flop tournament play. In poker tournaments, chips have no value. They're merely a means of survival. You make money in tournaments by surviving into later stages. And sometimes that means that the correct strategy is to actually pass on chips or accept a lower EV of chips for the sake of better survival odds. At the end of the day, ICM is just a utility function that gauges the value of chips according to how often each player will see each placement. ICM is not a perfect system, and it has some well-known flaws. However, it is surprisingly accurate. And to be frank, it's the best system we have for modeling tournament equities, especially when it comes to large fields. All right, guys, so I'm not going to spend any more on ICM fundamentals because, let's face it, we actually already have a ton of content about fundamentals. If you're looking for a quick crash course, there's an MTT playlist in the top right you can check out. In particular, I recommend these 4 videos of visualizing ICM in poker. This one gives you a nice intuitive understanding of why ICM is the way it is, followed by 5 ICM tips to crush poker tournaments. This is by our very own Stoyan Obreshkov, a tournament crusher. This is a very straightforward, to-the-point video with some simple, easy-to-make adjustments that will improve your results in poker tournaments. Then, a little deeper into the weeds, I'd recommend Matt Hunt's MTT Fundamentals, the Theory of Risk Advantage. This one is really cool because it explains basically the fundamental theory behind tournament outputs. That is to say, when two players have different risk premiums, when they value chips differently, that can cause the solution to behave in certain ways. And this theory explains what we see in solvers when it comes to ICM. And lastly, we have this video, You're Playing Tournaments Wrong, Here's Why. And this is basically a benchmark video that compares chip EV strategies to ICM strategies when it comes to poker tournaments. And it shows when ICM becomes important. So at what stage in the tournament does ICM actually start to matter? Spoiler, it's about 35% of the field remaining if 15% are paid. But it depends on the payout structure. Anyway, let's dive right in to Chapter 2. In this chapter, we're going to examine ICM pressure by tournament phase. The reason is we want to identify what phases of a tournament you should drastically alter your strategy, and in particular, when you need to make sweeping post-flop adjustments. We can't do that unless we know when ICM becomes critical. Now, Let's clarify a few things here. What do I mean by ICM pressure? Well, you can think of this as your incentive to survive. ICM pressure is caused by the fact that losing chips hurts you more than gaining chips helps you. And it's this mismatched risk-reward ratio that causes ICM pressure. We measure ICM pressure using metrics such as risk premium or bubble factor. Let's quickly recap these two metrics. Risk premium represents the difference between your chip EV pot odds and your dollar EV pot odds, which is just another way of saying if we were to value chips directly, that's chip EV pot odds, versus if we were to account for the ICM value of those chips, what's the difference? If there is no difference, well, your risk premium is 0%, and this is what we see in chip EV. But as ICM pressure increases, we see higher risk premiums representing higher pressure. We also have bubble factor, an equally good measurement. Bubble factor is just measured as the change to your EV if you lose divided by the change to your EV if you win. And this is measured as an absolute value of this ratio. So a bubble factor of 1 is chip EV, right? Losses hurt just as much as winning helps. But in tournaments, losses hurt more than winning helps. So we see numbers higher than 1, right? 1.5, even 2, 2.5. And this represents how much worse the risk is compared to the reward. Higher bubble factor, higher ICM pressure. Anyway, I'll link to a description in an article that goes into these metrics a bit more if you're a math connoisseur. The following charts show average risk premium throughout the life of a tournament. So risk premium representing ICM pressure is on the y-axis, and the number of players remaining is shown on the x-axis. You can see this one is for the 2024 WSOP main event. And the way I make these is by assuming that every stack in the tournament is the same size. Now, why would I make this ignorant assumption? Simply because it allows me to calculate the bubble factor for 10,000 different placements very, very quickly. So it's easy to make these charts with that assumption. Realistically, stacks are going to be asymmetric. There's going to be short stacks and big stacks, and that actually increases the risk premium. So the charts I'm about to show you, full disclosure, slightly underrepresent the tournament pressure. Regardless, all we really want them for is to get an idea of which spots we're going to experience high ICM pressure and which spots we're going to experience less ICM pressure. That will allow you to group your strategy and learn when to make decisive moves. At the very beginning, even the very first hand of WSOP, there's a little bit of tournament pressure, right? A little over 1% risk premium, so it's pretty close to chip EV, but there's still a little bit of tournament pressure. Between 50 and 25% of players left, you can see it steeply rising in a smooth curve all the way up to the bubble. Now, the very first adjustment you'll want to make is somewhere between 50 and 25% of the field remaining. At 25%, it's at about the same level as it will be after the bubble pops. At the bubble, we experience the first peak, and this is where ICM pressure is very high, especially for short stacks. After the bubble pops, it's going to drop down to around 5-6% and slowly trend upwards in this chaotic zigzag pattern. These zigzags are caused by flat areas of the payout distribution followed by pay jumps. On the final table, risk premium again surges, where this is again where we experience a lot of ICM pressure, and then it drops off. Once there are only 2 players remaining, there is no more ICM pressure. Now we can take a look at the same chart for our GTO Wizard payout structure. So this is just our native in-app 1,000 player classic tournament, and you can see it follows the exact same shape, a smooth rise from the full field to the bubble, followed by a sharp drop, and then a zigzag chaotic path all the way up to the final table. So again, you're going to want to start paying attention, especially around 25-35% of the field remaining on the bubble and as you approach the final table. Then here's the same one. This is for our 200 player classic. And here we can start to see a little more of the detail, but it's the exact same pattern, right? So a smooth curve up to the bubble. It drops suddenly, the ICM pressure drops drastically, and then a zigzag pattern back up to the final table. Now you'll note that in this case, whether there's 2 tables remaining, 3 tables, 4 tables remaining is kind of irrelevant. What matters is the percentage of the field remaining realistically, right? So WSOP, 2 tables remaining is an enormous amount of ICM pressure. whereas 200-player classic, 2-3 tables remaining, is a lot less ICM pressure comparatively. So realistically, what matters in terms of risk premium, if you're just trying to develop a heuristic, is what percent of the field remains relative to the payout structure. In particular, how top-heavy the payout structure also has a big effect. So if we go back to WSOP here, we can see that most of the time it stays under 10%, except at the very biggest peaks where it goes up to 11%. Whereas in the 200-player classic, on the bubble, it was almost 15%. And a decent chunk of the time, the ICM pressure was above 10%. So it's a pretty high risk premium. And this is because the 200-player classic payout structure in GTO Wizard is a lot flatter than the very top-heavy, huge prizes at WSOP, where they designate a lot of money to first. Anyway, I've developed a program that kind of automatically makes these charts, and I'm hoping to release them for a ton of different tournament structures later this year. But I just wanted to give you guys a flavor of when risk premiums spike, when ICM becomes really important, and how that shifts throughout the life of a tournament. Hopefully these charts have done just that. Chapter 3, Post-Flop Adjustments, and now we arrive at the heart of the video. We're going to start with some toy game math, and this is important because it reveals the underlying dynamics that cause you to both bluff and fold more in MTTs. We're going to talk a little bit about leakage, which is this concept that the sum of expected values of both players is not constant. You can actually leak EV to the rest of the field depending on how aggressive both strategies are. We'll cover some basic tips. For example, a covering player can be more aggressive. Downward drift, that is the tendency of solvers to prefer smaller bet and raise sizes. And we'll also cover why solvers seem to prefer lower variance lines. All right, let's start with some toy game math. We'll imagine a very simple scenario. So there are 3 players remaining in a satellite and 2 places are paid, meaning the top 2 places get tickets. It's going to be a polarized versus bluff catcher river toy game with symmetrical 10 big blind stacks and a 2 big blind starting pot. What we want to solve is the optimal river strategy, both for chip EV and for ICM. And we're going to compare and contrast how those change. The first thing we need to do is break down outcomes. And the reason this is important is because we need to know exactly how much you're gaining or losing in all scenarios. So on the river, there's only 4 scenarios we need to look at in a polarized versus bluff catcher toy game. Now remember, in position has either the nuts or a bluff. They're polarized, and out of position has a bluff catcher. So the first scenario is it goes check, check. Button stack always remains the same. They're the folded player. If it goes check, check, well, big blind's only checking behind with bluffs or with air that can't win, so they always lose. Therefore, the small blind wins that 2 big blinds. And they're new EVs. And here we're just saying the prizes are $50, $50, and 0 for third place. So we can see small blind and big blind's EV. So, you win $3. The next scenario is check, bet, fold. In this case, the big blind picks up the 2 big blind pot, and their EV increases by a couple dollars. Third scenario is check, bet, call, and small blind wins. And this is a huge shift because then the small blind ends up with $50 worth of EV, and the button ends up with 0. And finally, check, bet, call, big blind wins. In this case, the small blind is eliminated, and the big blind wins the $50 ticket. As we can see, there are only 4 scenarios. And the reason we needed to calculate all of these numbers was because we'll need them in order to precisely calculate the bluffing and folding frequencies of this toy game. In the Resources tab of GTO Wizard, you can find this free ICM calculator. We'll use this to calculate the actual expected value, according to ICM, of all of these outcomes. So firstly, it's a satellite, so the top 2 places are paid, and I'll represent that with prizes of $50 and $50. It doesn't actually matter what you put here, as long as these 2 prizes are equal, representing 2 tickets to the higher tournament. Then for the stacks, we'll add these in. So the first case, we'll say bet, check, check, and big blind loses. So 10 for the folded button, 12, that's 10 plus the pot of 2 for the small blind, and 10 for the big blind. And here we can see the dollar EV, 32.1 and 35.8. Diving into the GTO Wizard example. So again, just taking a look at the ranges here, in position has either the nuts, ace-ace, or bluffs, queens through tens here. And out of position has a bluff catcher, kings. It beats all the queens through tens, loses to the aces. So, question to the audience. How often should we be bluffing in the ICM version of this toy game? Now right here, what we're looking at, this is the chip EV version. And according to chip EV, you should be bluffing about 45% of the time. How often should you be bluffing in ICM? Well, you might be surprised to learn the answer is D. And here we can take a look at the ICM version of this sim, hover over this icon and see we're bluffing 64% of the time, which is strange because why can Big Blind get away with bluffing more often than they're value betting? And if so, shouldn't small blind just always call? Well, that's another question to the audience. How often should small blind call this 5x pot shove? Well, in chip EV, they should call about 17% of the time. But in ICM, despite the fact that they're bluffing more often, small blind should fold more often. They should call only 10% of the time instead of 16. What's up with that? How does that work? Why is it that in ICM spots, where both players are under a tremendous amount of ICM pressure, you should both bluff more as the aggressor and fold more as the defender? Well, let's dive into the math and find out. The cool part about poker is that if you understand math, you can actually figure out the optimal strategy. So we can look at the solver, but we can also just solve it directly. In order to solve this toy game, you need to understand the inverse correlation between bluffing and calling. The risk reward of calling determines how often one should bluff, and the risk reward of bluffing determines how often one should call. So if you're sitting there wondering how often I should call, well, it depends how big your opponent has bet. And conversely, if you're wondering how often you should bluff, it is also determined by, well, how often or how big the bet is, right? And so everything's really determined by sizing. Now, I'm going to start with the bluffing frequencies. Bluffing frequencies in position on the river is just equal to the pot odds laid, right? And we have chip EV on the left, ICM on the right. Well, the cool thing is that it's actually the same equation in both cases. It's just that in chip EV, the risk and reward are in big blinds, whereas in ICM, the risk and reward are in dollars. On the left-hand side, we see, again, pot odds is equal to risk divided by risk plus reward, and this is the risk reward of calling. Remember that pot odds is basically the odds to call. In this case, you can imagine you're a small blind facing a shove on the river. If you call incorrectly, you're going to lose 10 chips. If you call correctly, you'll win your opponent's bet of 10 plus the pot of 2 for a total of 12 chips. The pot odds is then equal to the bluffing frequency, which is 10 divided by 22, or about 45%. ICM is the exact same process, except this time the risk is $32 and the reward is $17.90. Now, how did I calculate this? Well, again, it's just, if you stack them, you'll have $50. You'll win basically one of the tickets, and that is $17 higher than the EV of just giving up, right? And so the bluffing frequency is this divided by this plus this, which is 64%. Now, I want you to notice something curious here. I'm going to point out the fact that in ICM, you can actually bluff more than half the time. That can never happen in chip EV, because in chip EV, the reward can never be smaller than the risk of calling, because you always win your opponent's bet plus the pot, right? There's always a little bit of extra there. So this can never be 50%. Whereas in ICM, the risk can vastly outpace the reward of calling, and therefore the opponent needs to bluff more often, which is strange, right? But here's another way to think about it. Imagine you're in position, and your opponent knows that calling is super risky. It's almost twice as risky as it is rewardy, right? And so you need to sweeten the pot. You need to incentivize them to call more often. How do you do that? Well, you bluff more often. You give them an incentive to call in order to make them indifferent between calling and folding. And the way to do that is by bluffing more. And that's why when you increase ICM pressure, the aggressor should be bluffing more often, not just on the river, but across all streets. Okay, now let's go back to calling frequencies. And again, how often you should call is just determined by the risk reward of bluffing. It's that inverse relationship we talked about. Again, it's the exact same process on both sides, just that in chip EV, we plug in big blinds, and in ICM, we plug in dollars. So in chip EV, the call percentage is just equal to your minimum defense frequency, which is 1 minus alpha, or alpha is the break-even frequency of bluffing. And so imagine you are in position shoving here. You're risking 10, so if you bluff and get called, you lose your stack of 10. But if they fold, you'll gain 2. So the risk is 10, the reward is 2, and therefore you need your opponent to fold 83% of the time in order to break even on a bluff. Therefore, the calling frequency in equilibrium is 16.7%. Now at ICM, it's the same thing, except that this time we're risking $32.10. So if you shove and they call, you lose $32.10 of tournament equity. However, if you shove and they fold, you'll gain $3.69. So we get this pretty terrible risk-reward ratio. But again, we can calculate it. The fold percentage is just this divided by this plus this, 89.7. 1 minus that is 10%. So interesting that we see that as the risk premium increases, as the risk outpaces the reward, MDF decreases. So that one should be fairly obvious. You're getting a worse price, call less often. Let's just summarize this quickly. In chip EV, in position should bluff 45% of the time, out of position should call 17%. In ICM, in the exact same spot, in position should bluff 64% of the time, and out of position should call 10% of the time. So we're both bluffing more often and calling less often. All right, that's enough toy game math. Next, I want to briefly touch on the concept of leakage. You see, when you win a pot in a tournament, you don't just gain the value of that pot. In fact, the EV is redistributed across the entire field, impacting all players. And oftentimes what that means is that some of the value you take from your opponent leaks to the rest of the field due to the redistribution of this tournament equity. In general, imbalancing stacks tends to leak EV to the field, whereas evening out stacks between two players tends to drain or take EV from the rest of the field. Here's a useful graphic. So in this case, it's 200 entries, classic GTO Wizard tournament structure, 33 players remain and 30 are paid with 40 big blind symmetrical stacks. So we're on the bubble here. And what this graph on the right shows is your profit, so how much your dollar EV increases relative to the amount of big blinds you take off of your opponent. Now remember, it's symmetrical stacks, so you cover each other, so if you get it in, you just stack them. Now if you stack your opponent, they're going to lose $1,212 of EV. You'll gain 698 of those dollars, and the remaining 514, well, that just gets leaked to the rest of the field. That works out to about a 42% tax, and you can see that the leakage is not constant. It increases as you take more and more chips out off of your opponent. And this is kind of the fundamental idea behind tournaments, right? Is that the value you gain is not as much as the value you lose. So in this case, doubling up gains you $698, whereas if you're the one getting stacked, you're losing $1,212. And that's a bubble factor of just under 2. So we can see why leakage is an important consideration in tournaments. And this is exactly what caused the ICM pressure in our earlier toy game. When you stack your opponent, your EV increases from about $32 to $50, whereas if you get stacked, you lose all 32. So you stand to gain a few dollars, about 17, but you stand to lose about 30. And the reason is that in all these scenarios, the button stack remains the same. And in every single case, the button is gaining EV. If one of them stacks each other, the button wins a ticket. That's $50 EV for the folded button. And even if not, just the redistribution of stacks will actually increase the button's EV a little bit from baseline. So that's the interesting thing about tournaments, is that EV gets redistributed to the entire field, not just players in the hand. Another useful tip to keep in mind is who covers whom and by how much. As a general rule, the covering player should be more aggressive, and this comes down to risk advantage. You see, when stacks go in, the covered player risks a lot, but the covering player risks only a bit. And generally speaking, the bigger the stack, the more aggro you should be. The more you cover your opponent, the more aggro you should be. And this gets amplified as the risk premium increases, for example, on the bubble or at a final table. Downward drift is a phenomenon coined by Barry Carter and Dara O'Kearney. It describes this idea that solvers seem to prefer smaller bet and raise sizes in ICM spots compared to chip EV spots. The reason for this is the same reason as why you bluff more in tournaments, because your opponent doesn't have much incentive to call. It's very risky, and so you need to sweeten the deal a bit. The two ways to do that are to bet smaller and to bluff more often. And this is largely where the idea of small ball poker comes from. It's derived from the very math of ICM. The second major thing we notice is that solvers prefer lower variance lines in poker tournaments. The reason for this is mostly because variance tends to lower your dollar EV. Solvers prefer low variance because, well, more stable outcomes tend to have higher dollar EV compared to more polarized outcomes. As an example, if you're the player calling the shove, there's only two outcomes. Either you get stacked or you stack them. That's a very high variance outcome. And this can manifest in a number of different ways. For one, you might notice that in ICM spots, solvers prefer to just 3-bet shove pre-flop, which seems high variance, but because you expect your opponent to fold so often, it's actually quite a low variance move. Secondly, it manifests as, well, smaller bet and raise sizes, because, let's face it, if you're betting smaller on the flop, well, there tends to be less variance by the time you get to showdown. And so there are a number of ways in which this manifests throughout solver strategies that are obvious and not so obvious, but these two governing principles do tend to have a big impact on the way optimal poker strategy is played. Next, I'll give you a brief example of downward drift in tournaments. So imagine you're on the bubble in a 1,000 player classic tournament. You open the cutoff and it gets called by the big blind. We're going to solve this with AI, which will import all of the prizes, stacks, and ranges. And you can see that, well, the big blind covers us. It's pretty close. Now, here, we'll set some fixed strategy, or some fixed bet sizes. So I'm going to give cutoff 33, 66, and 100. And for the raise sizes, we can just go like 40, 80. Something like this. And the reason I'm setting it up this way with fixed sizes rather than automatic sizes is because I want to compare how the sizes change between ICM and chip EV. So I'll create this solution and we'll choose some flop. Let's say King 8-7. All right, so you can see that the solver largely prefers the smaller bet sizes here. If you're going to c-bet, you should mainly be betting 1/3. There is a little bit of 2/3 in there. But let's see what happens if we put the exact same flop into the solver as chip EV. And the way I'm going to do this is I'll just right-click, duplicate this tab, like so. Then I'll just click this little pencil icon to edit the solution, and I'm going to change this one to chip EV. Right, so it's the exact same setup, except now our equity model is chip EV rather than ICM. And here you can see that the bet size increases. So in ICM, we're almost always using the smaller bet, whereas in chip EV, the solver starts to prefer this medium bet size. All right, guys, that's my video. I'll put some links in the description if you'd like to learn more about ICM. And as always, happy grinding.